I mean, my background again, I suppose I've acted for the likes of Realex, since incorporation, and back in the late 90s when I was a young whippersnapper, about to qualify as a solicitor, I wasn't interested in doing conveyancing or probate. I was interested in doing something that no old fellow would be able to say he'd been doing for 40 years before me. So e-business looked like it might be something that might be attractive, might be innovative, might be a bit of fun. Okay, so we got stuck into it around then, and it's sort of stuck with me since. What I want to talk to you about today in terms of the whole issues of payments are the different roles that the different players within the sector play, both as consumers, merchants, banks, payment processors. Talk about who they are, talk about how they are governed legally, and how they are not governed in many respects legally, how we sort of address those things, and maybe just to try and get the discussion going around where we go from here, So if we talk about who is who in an ordinary online transaction, I know this might be slightly remedial, but bear with me, it should call together. If we think of the purchaser, he's the person making the payment on the website. He's a card holder, he's an account holder, as Colm said. In data protection terms, he's a data subject entitled to certain privacy entitlements. In consumer protection terms, he's a consumer if he's acting outside of the course of his business, so he attracts a lot of protection from legislation in that sphere. Even businesses, when they in the business-to-business environment, also have, to one degree or another, albeit lesser, level of protection. Can be located anywhere, fixed and increasingly mobile access to the internet is enabling people to access from whenever they want. As Colm said, this is nothing to do with Ireland. It's to do with fulfilling consumers' needs and purchasers' needs. What risks does he bear when he makes a purchase? Well, they're the same risks that we talked about 12 years ago. He's worried about his privacy, he's worried about fraud on his card, he's worried about non-delivery of the goods or services that he buys online. Okay, we're talking about them for 10 years. And then there's this whole SEPA business, and this is the Single European Payments area, and the notion that we will streamline the ability to make payments, cross-border fulfillment of transactions, of online transactions. What will that mean for the purchaser? Well, it should mean as e-business becomes a little bit easier, albeit his bank account number might change a little bit. Okay. So what about the merchant? Okay, so the website that's making the sale, what's he concerned about, or who is he? Well, he's a business seller, so he's selling in the course of trade. In legal terms, under the European directives, he's a distance seller because he's fulfilling distance contracts. In data protection terms, he's a data controller, so he's responsible for all of the personal data that the consumers give to him in the context of making the purchase or even making an inquiry on his website. He can be located in the EU to be caught by most of the legislation I'll mention, or even just selling into the EU. He'll attract the jurisdiction of lots of the European directives in the whole area of e-business. Generally unregulated, like your local equivalent on the high street. Not particularly regulated, except of course if you're in a regulated industry like pharma or medical. So trying to sell Viagra online, although it's probably a very popular hobby of many, it's not a very legal one. He bears the fraud and the chargeback risks. So as Colm has said, here we are, so further down the road of e-business, with everybody here having now made purchases and got the accounts and all the rest. The poor old merchant is still sitting there bearing the risk of a chargeback if things go wrong, if I repudiate my transaction. He's bearing at least some of the risk in relation to fraud, and Colm has told you about some of the areas in which the industry is trying to reduce that risk or reallocate responsibility for the chargeback. And again, what does SEPA mean to him? Well, it means easier cross-border e-business because he should have more and easier ways of getting paid securely across the European Union. Then we have the banks, and I'm not going to do bank bashing. I think there's been probably enough of that in recent years. But if we think of what banks are to us, they authorise payments. Traditionally, they've always operated in a staged regulatory environment. Okay, accountable to regulators to one degree or another. Okay. Traditionally, again, risk averse, not the fastest movers in the world when it comes to innovation online, and obviously currently in the trenches with regard to lots of priority issues taking their attention. They've always been regulated, so the PSD, the Payment Services Directive that's coming through, it'll be a bit of a pain in the rear end for them, but it's just another box to be ticked, I suppose, at its most simple. I should say as well, I'm not a banking lawyer, so like any good presentation, I should have said at the start, terms and conditions apply. So if you don't rely on anything I say about banking law before speaking to somebody who knows what they're talking about. But again, so I don't envisage banks are particularly worried about PSD. In fact, speaking with Russell just earlier on, I mean, from the bank's perspective, there's nothing in it for them, for the PSD, except perhaps a further cut on margins that they might be making through the whole payment schemes as they stand. So, in my view, a simplistic view, that SEPA presents to them just an additional compliance burden, which might help explain why the pace of change has been so slow. So then, if we talk about payment service providers like Realex or like the other examples that Colm has talked about, they're an intermediary sitting between the merchant and the bank, currently unregulated. So when Colm came in with this idea of a company, called Pay and Shop Limited, we said, well, you must be regulated somewhere, So we looked at all the legislation. I'll talk about some of them. Actually, not regulated at all. Doesn't hold funds. You could be caught under these various headings of e-money or money transmission services, etc. But as a general rule, not regulated, unlike the banks. Okay. From a data protection perspective, they're a data processor acting on behalf of the merchant, so they're not responsible for all of the data compliance that the merchant is responsible for, provided they process the data of the customer safely and on behalf of the merchant, and they keep it secure. They'll have discharged and ticked the box on data protection. Located in Ireland, let's talk about that, or post-BSD, as Colm mentioned, anywhere in the EU, and you can passport yourself around the place if and when you're regulated under the BSD. Tends to be quick adapter, as you've seen with Colm's business and the business he's built over a relatively short space of time. Quick to adapt to the emerging market trends, tends to add value to the merchant's experience, not just simply providing a sort of a payment processing service in isolation. Okay. But as Colm also mentioned, with effect from the 1st of November 2009, these guys are going to be regulated for the first time to one degree or another, or else they're going to have to figure out why they're not regulated under the BSD, and that presents a regulatory challenge for the first time in the sector, I suppose, for many people. I wanted to mention this because if we looked at where we've come from and where we're going, it's remarkable how some things never change. This is back in '98 with good old Bertie and Bill. Sorry about that, Gareth. I didn't know you were going to be here. But you might recall this, but there was a big splash about Bertie and Bill Clinton signing on the communique using digital signatures in 1998. And Ireland is an e-commerce hub, and I remember Mary O'Rourke at the time. At every she would have attended the opening of an envelope, if it was an opportunity to announce Ireland as the hub for e-commerce, this great new thing called e-commerce. We could be the European hub, and then she even changed it. We weren't going to be a hub anymore. We were going to be a platform, because there's more room on a platform than on a hub. And this was the great big thing, back in the late 90s. Okay, and if you had anticipated what would we be doing in 2009, well, late 90s, we were all dabbling a little bit in the internet. It was still a little bit. People were reluctant to make purchases. But if you had imagined what would the internet be like in 2009, we would have imagined, well, first of all, we log into our computers with our fingers or our iris, and we command our bank to transfer money to the merchant by speaking or by, looking at the corner of the PC or something like that. When in reality, if you look at the way you do your online banking in 1998, if your bank even offered you online banking in 1998, and the same login page when you log in today to do your online banking, it's almost precisely the same. And the levels of security around it are almost precisely the same. I mean, they've evolved, but not in the radical way we all expected. So here we are in 1998. This is, a million years ago in technological terms. They're using encryption technology to digitally sign a document. And that digital technology hasn't even become mainstream in the 11 years since. A couple of exceptions, like the Revenue Online Service, who do issue digital certificates. But no, we didn't. We're not now where we thought we would be. Even if I think of the IIEA, I looked up in my old files, and I was invited along to the IIEA in October 2000, and the big challenge was, EU deregulation and its impact on national regulation, and I remember all the arguments at the time where e-commerce is all very well, but if you buy something online, is it really a contract? Or will a judge really recognise it? Will the courts, what the courts make of this internet business? So there was lots of lawyers made lots of money on it. When Y2K passed without the world coming to an end, lawyers had to think something else to do in the early 2000s. So of course we all sat around and we discussed, telecoms liberalisation. Is that going to present a great opportunity now for us to roll out Ireland as an e-business, an active e-business hub? And actually, there was lots of law. And again, this is the trend always, is that the law follows the practice, okay? So we have people now trading online, but we had a dearth of law, okay? And if we look at the law that's happened in sort of chronological order, the Electronic Commerce Act, again, we made a huge splash about that at the time. What did we do? We implemented the European directive a few months early. that's what we did. We made a big splash about it, and we told the Americans, come to Ireland. If you do your transactions out of Ireland, you are guaranteed that your contracts will be legally binding. Your courts will enforce them, and you'll have full legal certainty about your operations. All we were doing was implementing the Electronic Signatures Directive. We had to do it anyway, but it was good PR stunt. Then our distance contracts regulations in 2001, again, just implementing another directive. What were they doing? Well, then this is Europe going, well, this e-commerce business is all very well, but what about all these punters who are buying things online from a website and they never get the stuff? And then when they go back in to find the website, it's gone. And the website is just a URL with an address. You've no idea who you're actually contracting with, and the divergence of approach of websites as to how they bound you to a sale was very, very vast. So you never knew. When you're buying something online and you're click, 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 and you never know at what stage they're suddenly going to go, boom, thank you, you've just ordered 14,000 units of an iPod Nano, and we've just charged your credit card for 150 million euros. Well, the distance contracts regulations and the e-commerce regulations were designed to try and streamline that and harmonise the process for consumers to be able to know what they were entering into, with who they were entering into a contract, so prior information and confirmation of the key contract terms, and obliging the supplier to provide the goods within 30 days, and giving consumers a cooling off right. If you have time later, I'll give you one or two anecdotes as to how this legislation can be abused by consumers to their own benefit. Otherwise, the data protection legislation, again, just updated in 2003. This is more typical, I suppose, to be my cynical self again. This is more typical of our approach to implementing directives. We implemented the 1995 Data Protection Directive, which had a transposition date of October 1998. We implemented that in July 2003, which is a bit more like the old the way we know and love, right? And then the Transparency Directive, again, the European Union pushing this notion that we should be transparent on a website, because a customer who goes into a shop on Grafton Street has a sense that that shop has been there yesterday, will be there tomorrow, and has a chance to try on the trousers before they buy them, etc. A website, yet we did not quite know who we're contracting with. So sort of a letterhead as for websites, and an obligation again throughout the European Union to bring transparency to that process. And then a new departure, the PSD, for the first time, as I say, bringing us into the whole area of regulation of banks. So it freaks me out. I'm not going to get away with all my innovative spoofing anymore, because we're going to be working now with banking lawyers who are used to dealing with regulators and things like that. But all of that stuff is EU driven. So how does it affect everybody? Well, from the purchaser's perspective, it's given them a lot more consumer protection. Okay, very specific consumer protection to allow you to cool off, change your mind after you've made a purchase. You still enjoy the benefit of all your mandatory local consumer laws when you make a purchase online. Even non-consumers have certain protections, and of course, if I want to bind myself to a contract over the internet with you, I can do so under whatever terms and conditions two businesses would agree. The consumer protection stuff will only protect me when I'm dealing with a consumer. And then as a data subject, I've got quite robust protections now, with the right to complain to a local data protection commissioner if my data protection and privacy rights aren't respected. And then again, I have a certain amount of protection against fraud at legislation. It's not very strong, but there are a couple of references to the fact that the consumer shouldn't be held accountable for when fraudulent use has been made of his payment card. On the merchant side then, he has to comply with these new regulations, but really it's not all that burdensome. It's simply coordinating your sales approach the same way as you have goods on a shelf. You have a cash register and you have someone at the cash register and you take their money, you give them a receipt and you put the stuff in the bag. There's an online equivalent now. Okay, must comply with the Data Protection Act. Not everyone's doing a great job of that. Protects itself by contracts again. So he has contracts on his website trying to protect himself in relation to his consumers. Contract with his fulfillment partners who are going to deliver the goods on his behalf throughout the European Union. He'll have contract with the PSP. If he has a contract with Realex, it'll be a really well-crafted contract, which is non-negotiable, by the way. And then he'll have his contract with his banks, which will be similarly non-negotiable. Okay. And despite the idea that the European Union introduced in the e-commerce directive that there will be a country of origin principle, that if I establish my network here in Ireland, my business here in Ireland, I only have to comply with Irish laws. That doesn't really work in principle. There's too many exceptions. So if I target customers in another EU member state and they're consumers, they're entitled to sue me in their home jurisdiction, notwithstanding the fact that my terms and conditions said that we would be going by Irish law. Then the big banks and the card schemes, they're used to complying with all the regulatory stuff. They're worried about fraud. They don't want to entertain any risk in relation to fraud. They protect themselves by contracts, again, of the standard bank will not be liable under any circumstances for anything type. Even the rules of the schemes are contracts. Remarkably, Visa and MasterCard, there's no kind of legislation truly governing that. I mean, that's a kind of nearly like a cooperative arrangement in many respects, governed by contracts between the members. Obviously, they're in the trenches, as I said, and there are other legal issues around competition law and things like that as to how they organise their pricing around all of the use of cards, and the European Commission is looking at those. So then we have the PSP. He has to comply with his PCI standards in order to keep his accreditation there. But again, that's not a legally binding obligation. He's interested in reducing the fraud and the chargeback risk on behalf of his merchants to make the proposition compelling. And a specialist, as I say, at value-added services, not just reducing the risk of fraud, but perhaps, batching files and information in a very usable format for his merchants, customers, his customers. Again, protecting himself by contracts, doesn't hold funds, so he's not regulated as a bank, but the PSD may change this. So, I mean, the internet is ripe for innovation, obviously, right? And Ireland, as Joe said, is ideally positioned for innovation. And I work in lots of weird areas like betting and gaming, online betting and gaming. Where the legislation is 1931 and 1956. The Betting Act, and they're talking about reforming it. But they've been reforming it for yonks. In the meantime, lawyers make money out of creative structures, and Paddy Power's share price holds up in a downturn. Similarly, in the payment processing side, there's been loads of innovators. PayPal, very, very popular means of making payments. So popular, of course, they got bought by eBay. But again, an alternative to a simply credit or debit card system. The likes of money bookers and the likes of Neteller. Again, these are alternative means of making payments over the internet with innovative young companies who've grown up. And in fact, what's interesting about PayPal is, for example, PayPal is now licensed under Luxembourg credit as a Luxembourg credit institution. Yet they have a massive presence down in Blanchardstown. Why aren't they regulated in Ireland? With a good, proper regulatory framework around them. Money bookers, they're regulated as an e-money institution under the FSA in the UK, as are Neteller. So that's sort of where we are at the moment. There's lots going on. Then if we look at what's coming down the track, I think the SEPA thing, it runs a very serious risk of being a very damp squib. And it'll be interesting to see how whether the pace of change, which has been slow, as Colm said, is going to change. As a lawyer who sits down with a banking lawyer, luckily I bought one with me, and when I'm talking about something like this, I always accompany myself with somebody who knows what they're talking about, so Aidan will take all the hard questions. But again, when we try and discuss this, that this isn't unusual for IT lawyers, where sometimes we have to sit down with people and say, well look, this is how the business works, it's not a bank, it's this is where we sit, and this is how the internet works, and all the rest, and they say, well, actually, this is what the Central Bank Act says, or this is what the Betting Act of 1931 says, right? And you won't find a mention of a computer, let alone the internet, in many of the legislation. So you find, are we a payment system under the Central Bank Act, or are we, a money transmission system? And you sometimes ask the financial regulator for guidance, and then you have to explain to them the nature of the business model, and they say, when we set up innovative betting models with betting exchanges and stuff like that, they came back and said, oh no, we don't do betting, the revenue do betting. And go to the revenue, and they say, well, that looks very much like the type of thing that the stockbrokers do. So I think we should talk to the financial regulator. And say, no, we definitely don't do that. So we've been here before, right? In terms of these kind of business models and trying to get regulated in an area that's traditionally been a bit sluggish when it comes to adopting to new models. Okay, so how do payment service providers end up regulated at the end of this year? Is there much guidance? I mean, if you contrast the position here with regard to the position in the UK, where you now have draft application forms, because there are struggles here, there are challenges. Am I a payment institution as required by the legislation? It's complicated, but at least over the FSA, you've got the guidance notes, you've got the draft application forms, the consultation periods have ended, and all the rest. From what I can gather on the PSD here, we're stuck in a little bit of a black hole, and November is only a few months away. So what's the opportunity? Well, it's a little like e-commerce in the 90s and the 2000s, you know. Legislators are playing catch-up in Europe, and the regulators are playing catch-up with the legislators, you know. And they're all coming to grips with innovative payment systems. I think we need to get the PSD established quickly so that we have some sort of clarity around this. How bizarre if Colm Lyon's company has to go to the UK to get regulated under the PSD and then passport it back into Ireland. I mean, that's just not acceptable, really, okay? Otherwise, the FSA in the UK or any other EU member state they'll offer themselves like we did as an electronic commerce hub in 1999. Come to us, we're ideally placed, we've got a good regulatory system, you can be able to trade off your license in Malta or wherever it might be throughout the European Union. So why bother setting up in Ireland, despite all the attractive non-regulatory ingredients that would attract inward investment into Ireland traditionally, and continues to do so. There is some inward investment continuing to creep in here if you don't read all the bad news and the bad things. So that's all I wanted to say. I mean, obviously the whole idea is to throw it open to the floor. I hope it's given you some sense. We didn't know exactly how to pitch this, but that's the commercial and the legal from as we see it.
Thanks.